The 1960s promised bold visions of the future, but some films went so far out, they made the rule makers panic. Scenes were chopped, reels were trimmed, and audiences were left with stories missing their wildest edges. Why did some of the most colorful, mind-bending sci-fi adventures end up on the cutting room floor? And what secret fears of the time were hidden behind the censor's scissors? Let's dive into 13 trippy classics that got sliced apart. The Time Machine, 1960. What happens when a futuristic adventure turns into a nightmare of human cattle and shadowy predators? George Pal's dazzling adaptation of H.G. Wells' novel looked innocent enough at first glance. But when audiences witnessed the underground Morlocks herding fragile humans as if they were powerless captives, censors across the globe sounded the alarm. The film's glossy visuals couldn't hide the raw implication that civilization might collapse into a cruel cycle of prey and predator. British censors were particularly uncomfortable with the sequences where the pale, glowing-eyed Morlocks closed in on their trembling victims. The imagery of people being dragged underground wasn't just frightening. It was considered psychologically disturbing for family audiences in 1960. Some countries demanded heavy cuts, while others slapped the film with an adults-only label, unusual for what was meant to be mainstream science fiction. Why such strong reactions? Partly because The Time Machine dared to show the end result of progress, not as flying cars and gleaming towers, but as a horrifying devolution of humanity. In the middle of the Cold War, the suggestion that human beings could fall backward into barbarism was seen as dangerously pessimistic. The very notion that the beautiful Eloy could end up farmed as food hit a nerve, blending themes of class, survival, and destiny. Ironically, the censorship only increased the film's legend. Word spread about the too shocking Morlock scenes, making viewers more eager to see what had been hidden. Today, those sequences look tame compared to modern standards, but in their time, they pushed the boundaries of what could be shown on a theater screen. The Time Machine proved that even a studio picture could terrify gatekeepers when it hinted too clearly at the darker side of evolution. Village of the Damned, 1960. Imagine an entire town falling unconscious only to wake up and discover that every woman is suddenly expecting. That was the chilling premise behind Village of the Damned, adapted from John Wyndham's novel. What really rattled censors, however, wasn't the eerie opening, but the coldly intelligent children who arrived 9 months later. Pale-haired, emotionless, and possessing strange powers, these kids represented the ultimate parental nightmare. The American release immediately ran into problems. Scenes showing the children exerting their eerie influence, staring down adults, forcing people into dangerous actions were trimmed in some territories for being too intense. In an era obsessed with order and conformity, the idea of children outsmarting and overpowering their elders carried unsettling undertones. Censors worried about the imagery of adults losing control, especially when some scenes depicted consequences that were far too grim for family audiences. The film's tone didn't help. Unlike the colorful space operas of the day, Village of the Damned played things straight, with stark cinematography that gave it the feel of a documentary more than a fantasy. That sense of realism blurred the line between sci-fi and something audiences could actually imagine happening in their own backyard. When the children gathered in groups, silent and glowing-eyed, it was enough to make entire audiences squirm in their seats. Cuts varied from country to country, but the most controversial elements involved the fate of adults who stood up to the children. While toned down in some prints, the uncut version made it clear that defiance came at a steep cost. For 1960 audiences, seeing youngsters portrayed not as symbols of innocence but as cold, calculating forces of nature was a cultural shock. Decades later, the film remains a landmark not only for its eerie story, but for the way it showed how far censors would go to shield audiences from uncomfortable ideas. Village of the Damned asked a daring question. What if the future generation didn't need us at all? For many, that was more terrifying than any monster from outer space. X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes, 1963. What if you could see beyond the limits of human vision, through walls, through skin, even into realms not meant for human eyes? That was the terrifying promise behind Roger Corman's X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes. Ray Milland played a scientist whose experiments with his own sight lead to brilliance, and eventually to madness. But when the film was released, audiences didn't see the full picture. Several scenes were quietly trimmed, especially in the final act. Why? Because Corman went further than most filmmakers of the early 60s dared. Early reels showed the main character reveling in his new powers, peeking into locked rooms, uncovering secrets, but as his gift grew stronger, it became a curse. In test screenings, the most shocking moment came near the end, when his vision extended beyond the physical world into something cosmic, something terrifying. Corman originally delivered a climax where Milland, overwhelmed, the film hinted at a shocking conclusion to his torment. That sequence rattled preview audiences so badly that distributors demanded changes. In many countries, that original ending was censored or edited, with some prints cutting it down to a vague suggestion rather than a clear resolution. Even without the missing shots, the movie left audiences shaken. The idea of a man literally seeing too much, that knowledge could destroy rather than empower, was considered too heavy for what was supposed to be pulp sci-fi. The censorship gave the movie an almost legendary status. For decades, film fans whispered about the real ending, and some restoration projects later brought pieces of it back. Ironically, by censoring the most disturbing moment, studios only increased its mystique. X, The Man with the X-Ray Eyes became not just another low-budget sci-fi, but a cult classic that dared to suggest the human mind wasn't ready for ultimate knowledge. Sometimes the scariest thing of all is seeing what lies just beyond the edge of perception. The Damned, 1963. You've probably never seen a film this unsettling dressed up as a simple British-American co-production. Joseph Losey's The Damned, released in the U.S. under the title These Are the Damned, begins as a moody seaside drama about a biker gang, but quickly veers into strange and frightening territory. Beneath the cliffs, visitors discover a secret government facility where children are kept in isolation. The twist? These kids were made immune to radiation and bred for a future no one wanted to think about. From its first screenings, The Damned was a target for cuts. The image of children locked away like lab rats horrified censors. In an era when governments were supposed to project confidence and control, Losey's film dared to suggest they would sacrifice innocence in the name of military advantage. American distributors hesitated to touch it, delaying its U.S. release by nearly 2 years. British censors demanded edits to soften the bleakness, but even with cuts, the message was clear. The future was being built on chilling experiments. Adding to the unease was Losey's unflinching style. He showed the children not as monsters, but as victims, glowing with health, yet doomed to isolation. When adults stumbled into their underground prison, the kids' confusion and desperation made the story all the more painful. It wasn't violent in the usual sense, but the psychological impact was considered dangerous. The Damned became a victim of its own ambition. It dared to tackle Cold War paranoia head-on, and in doing so, it hit nerves that censors were determined to calm. Today, it stands as one of the most haunting sci-fi films of the 60s, remembered not for what was cut, but for the terrifying honesty it managed to keep intact. Sometimes, the scariest future isn't one of alien invasions, but of human institutions willing to sacrifice their own children. Dr. Strangelove, 1964. Stanley Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove may not look like a typical psychedelic sci-fi on the surface, but its surreal humor and nightmare logic put it firmly in that category. A black comedy about nuclear war sounds outrageous now, but in 1964 it was downright scandalous. The U.S. military wasn't laughing, and neither were censors. Entire sequences were flagged, and one infamous scene, a massive pie fight in the war room, was cut entirely after being judged too inappropriate. The cuts didn't stop there. Early drafts had dialogue directly naming real-life figures, which was quickly softened to avoid diplomatic fallout. Even so, the released film pushed boundaries with its absurd yet chilling scenario. A rogue general sets the world on the path to destruction, while leaders in the war room argue like squabbling children. The satire was so sharp that many viewers found it hard to laugh, and censors considered some of the material dangerously close to the truth. What truly unsettled officials was how close Kubrick's fiction came to exposing flaws in actual defense policies. The concept of a doomsday machine, the idea that a single error could trigger global catastrophe, these weren't just jokes. They were rooted in real fears of the Cold War. For censors and politicians, the film hit far too close to home, making it the subject of quiet behind-the-scenes pressure. In the end, Dr. Strangelove survived, but in a slightly trimmed form. The missing pie fight scene has since become legendary, a reminder of how far Kubrick originally intended to push the absurdity. Ironically, the cuts may have strengthened the film, keeping its tone razor-sharp rather than descending into slapstick. Today, it's hailed as one of the greatest satires ever made, a film that proved sometimes the most psychedelic vision isn't filled with flashing colors, but with truths too surreal to accept. Fantastic Voyage, 1966. What if the only way to save a man's life was to shrink a crew of scientists down to microscopic size and send them sailing through his bloodstream? That was the dazzling premise of Fantastic Voyage, one of the most visually inventive sci-fi adventures of the 1960s. But beneath its spectacular premise lay material that unnerved censors. The film's combination of body horror imagery and provocative symbolism pushed boundaries in ways many officials weren't comfortable with. Several international releases demanded trims to sequences where the crew navigated the inner body. Shots of blood cells, organ walls, and especially the suspenseful scene involving a knife-like blood clot were deemed too graphic for young audiences. Some censors felt the film blurred the line between science education and grotesque spectacle. In fact, a few countries initially slapped it with stricter age restrictions, unusual for a big-budget studio release backed by 20th Century Fox. Adding to the controversy were undertones that went beyond science fiction. The intimate journey through a human body struck some critics as metaphorical, even subversive, in the context of the 1960s, when Cold War anxieties about invasion, control, and vulnerability ran high. By showing that the human form itself could become a battlefield, Fantastic Voyage unsettled those who preferred their sci-fi confined to outer space. Despite the censorship, the film became a smash hit, winning Academy Awards for its groundbreaking visual effects and art direction. And thanks to restorations and modern streaming availability, viewers can now see more of the startling imagery that once had censors reaching for their scissors. Fantastic Voyage stands as proof that even mainstream Hollywood spectacle could get tangled in censorship debates when it dared to visualize the body and the future in ways too bold for the rule makers. Seconds, 1966. What if you could erase your entire life and start over, given a new face, a new name, a brand new identity? That's the disturbing question John Frankenheimer's Seconds asked, and it pushed censors into uncomfortable territory. Rock Hudson, cast against type, played a man who undergoes an experimental procedure to abandon his middle-class malaise. At first, the transformation seems like liberation, but soon the cracks show and the story turns into one of the bleakest sci-fi visions of the decade. The problem for censors wasn't just the story, but the way it was shown. Frankenheimer shot surgical procedures with startling detail, including long clinical close-ups that made audiences squirm. Several countries demanded cuts to soften those sequences, worried they were too graphic for mainstream viewers. Even the psychological content, watching a man lose his sense of self, controlled by mysterious corporate forces, was considered disturbing. Adding to the controversy was Rock Hudson himself. Known at the time for light romances, seeing him unravel in such a grim and surreal film shocked audiences. It was the kind of role that left people whispering long after leaving the theater. Censors feared that its combination of realistic medical imagery and existential dread could unsettle people far more than monsters or aliens. The film didn't fare well commercially, partly because of the censorship cloud surrounding it, but over time it became a cult classic. Its reputation grew as one of the most unsettling explorations of identity in American cinema. Seconds didn't need giant sets or flashy effects. It weaponized ordinary fears about aging, regret, and the cost of reinvention. For 60s audiences, it was too raw. For today's viewers, it stands as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most terrifying science fiction isn't about other worlds at all. It's about losing yourself. In this one, Wild in the Streets, 1968. By the late 60s, studios realized that youth culture wasn't just a trend, it was a tidal wave. But when Barry Shear's Wild in the Streets hit theaters, it took that wave to wild extremes. The film followed a rock star who rides teenage rebellion straight into political power, turning generational conflict into a surreal fantasy. For some audiences, it was exhilarating satire. For censors, it was a nightmare of imagery that had to be trimmed. The film showed young people seizing control, locking older generations away, and reshaping society in their image. The most controversial sequences involved the treatment of adults once the youth movement gained power. For many, these scenes struck far too close to real-life anxieties of the time. Generational conflict wasn't just a plot device, it was the nightly news. With college protests and clashes making headlines, Wild in the Streets seemed to mirror real fears of what could happen if the kids actually took over. Censors in several countries banned the film outright. In the US, edits were demanded to soften its most provocative imagery. Critics accused the film of glamorizing rebellion, while others said it demonized the very idea of youth power. Either way, it proved impossible to ignore. Despite the backlash, the movie gained a cult following, particularly among younger viewers who saw it as a wild middle finger to the establishment. It combined campy visuals, psychedelic style, and biting satire into something unforgettable. By exaggerating the generational divide, it hit on a truth that censors wished audiences wouldn't see. That beneath the surface, America in the 60s was deeply divided. Wild in the Streets became proof that sci-fi could reflect social tension as sharply as any drama. And by trying to censor it, the gatekeepers only ensured it would be remembered as one of the decade's most radical experiments. Barbarella, 1968. When you think of psychedelic 60s sci-fi, one film towers above the rest. Barbarella. Directed by Roger Vadim and starring Jane Fonda, it was a kaleidoscope of campy costumes, surreal sets, and wild adventures across the galaxy. But behind the candy-colored visuals was a problem for censors everywhere. Barbarella's playful tone and bold themes went further than most audiences, or authorities, were prepared for in 1968. The biggest target for cuts was the infamous excessive pleasure machine, where Barbarella's free spirit was tested by futuristic technology. The sequence wasn't violent, yet it was considered far too daring for many countries. European versions were sliced apart, while in the US, distributors debated how much they could leave in without alienating family audiences. Add to that Barbarella's daring costumes and unapologetic confidence, and the film quickly became a lightning rod for complaints. What unnerved censors wasn't just the imagery, but the message. Barbarella wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was steering her own ship, making her own choices, and having a blast doing it. That kind of autonomy clashed with the conservative image of women in mainstream films at the time. Wrapped in psychedelic visuals and fantastical designs, the film was far more than an adventure. It was a manifesto of independence hidden in glitter. Of course, the censorship backfired. By trimming it, authorities gave Barbarella a forbidden allure. Young audiences flocked to see what the fuss was about, and over time, the film became a cult sensation. Its influence stretched far beyond the 60s, inspiring music videos, comic books, and countless homages. What began as a film too outrageous for censors ended up rewriting the rules of what sci-fi could be. In the process, Barbarella turned into the ultimate symbol of 60s pop art cinema, flashy, strange, and utterly unforgettable. Planet of the Apes, 1968. Planet of the Apes wasn't just a sci-fi adventure, it was a mirror held up to society, and that's exactly why it rattled censors. Franklin J. Schaffner's masterpiece, starring Charlton Heston, imagined a world where apes ruled and humans were reduced to a primitive underclass. The action and spectacle drew audiences in, but the allegories hiding beneath the fur made gatekeepers deeply uncomfortable. Several countries bristled at the way the story flipped social order on its head. Watching humans treated as second-class citizens locked up and studied struck some viewers as more than fantasy. The parallels to real-life inequality and oppression were impossible to miss, even if the film never said it directly. In some places, cuts were made to soften the imagery of humans being corralled and mistreated. Elsewhere, the film was slapped with harsher age ratings to keep younger audiences out. Then came the ending, the Statue of Liberty half buried in sand. That single image was so powerful, so bleak, that it left audiences gasping. For censors, it was practically a political statement. The implication that humanity could destroy itself and reduce its proudest symbols to rubble felt like an open criticism of national pride. Some officials argued the shot was too demoralizing for wide release. Despite the pushback, Planet of the Apes became a massive hit. The very themes censors tried to dilute were the ones audiences remembered most. The film's mix of action, philosophy, and shock cemented it as one of the greatest sci-fi films ever made. The lesson? Sometimes the truth cuts deeper than any special effect, and no amount of trimming could erase the sting of that final revelation. Head, 1968. If Barbarella was glitter and spectacle, Head was chaos wrapped in a kaleidoscope. The Monkees, America's clean-cut pop group, teamed with director Bob Rafelson and co-writer Jack Nicholson to create one of the strangest, most psychedelic films of the decade. On the surface, it was a comedy. In reality, it was a razor-sharp satire of consumer culture, celebrity, and even the war overseas. And that's exactly why Censors hacked it to pieces. The film opened with a surreal sequence of the band leaping off a bridge, followed by a jumble of bizarre sketches. From giant vacuum cleaners to mock battlefields, Head refused to follow any logic but its own. But hidden in all the absurdity were blunt images, footage of real conflicts spliced into a pop music film. That mix of entertainment and harsh reality sent censors scrambling. Several distributors demanded cuts, while some theaters outright refused to screen it. For fans expecting another light-hearted Monkees sing-along, the movie was a shock. Instead of clean fun, they got biting parody, existential musings, and psychedelic visuals that seemed designed to scramble the brain. The film's very structure was considered too experimental for mainstream audiences, leaving censors unsure how to even categorize it. In many places, the compromise was to trim the most jarring imagery and sell the rest as youth comedy. The result was commercial disaster, but long-term cult glory. Head flopped on release, partly thanks to the censorship that dulled its bite, but later, generations rediscovered it, praising its fearless experimentation. Today, it's hailed as a psychedelic masterpiece, an anti-establishment gem disguised as a Monkees movie. In a way, the censors helped cement its legend. By trying to bury it, they guaranteed it would be dug up decades later as one of the boldest experiments of the 60s. 2001, A Space Odyssey, 1968. Stanley Kubrick's 2001. A Space Odyssey wasn't censored in the usual way. No government board-ordered trims, no scandal forced the studio's hand. Instead, it was Kubrick himself who wielded the scissors. After the film's premiere, critics complained it was too long, too abstract, too indulgent. Audiences walked out confused, unsure what they had just witnessed. So, Kubrick, famously controlling, cut nearly 20 minutes of footage. These weren't minor trims. Entire dialogue exchanges disappeared. Scenes that fleshed out characters were stripped away, and moments of humanity were replaced with long, wordless sequences of cosmic imagery. For some, this sharpened the film into the masterpiece we know today. For others, it felt like something essential had been lost. Was it censorship? Self-imposed? In a sense, yes. Kubrick censored his own vision to fit what he thought audiences could handle. The irony is that the film was already radical for its time. With its hypnotic pacing, stunning visuals, and trippy Stargate sequence, 2001 felt like nothing audiences had ever seen before. It was psychedelic not in color schemes alone, but in its willingness to abandon narrative convention altogether. By removing parts of it, Kubrick ensured the final version was both more streamlined and more mysterious. Decades later, the lost footage has never been restored. What was in those reels remains mostly a matter of speculation. And yet, the legend of what we didn't get to see has only made the film's reputation stronger. 2001. A Space Odyssey became one of the most influential sci-fi films ever made, precisely because it left so much unsaid, so much unseen. Sometimes the most powerful form of censorship comes from the artist's own hand. Skidoo, 1968. By 1968, mainstream Hollywood wanted a piece of the youth market, and Otto Preminger, a director better known for courtroom dramas, decided to deliver it in the weirdest way possible. The result was Skidoo, a surreal, psychedelic comedy featuring Jackie Gleason, Groucho Marx, and a cast of Hollywood veterans trying to tap into the counterculture vibe. What could go wrong? Everything, apparently. Skidoo was filled with wild visual gags, swirling colors, and offbeat humor that bordered on incoherent. But what really spooked censors were the nods to altered states of mind and the film's irreverent attitude toward authority. Scenes that suggested expanded consciousness through zany visuals and bizarre behavior were heavily scrutinized. Some international releases cut entire sequences that were deemed inappropriate or too suggestive of real-life controversies. American audiences were baffled. Was it a parody? A satire? A genuine attempt to connect with younger viewers? The tone swung wildly, and critics tore it apart. But beneath the chaos, Skidoo was undeniably bold. It dared to mock political leaders, lampoon generational divides, and dive headfirst into psychedelic aesthetics. For censors, that was enough to put it under the knife. The result was a chopped-up release that pleased no one. The film bombed, vanishing quickly from theaters. Yet in the decades since, it has gained a strange cult following. Viewers revisit it not for coherence, but for its sheer audacity. Skidoo stands as a testament to the 60s experimental spirit, an era when even mainstream directors took wild risks, only to see their work shredded for stepping too far out of line. So, there you have it. 13 psychedelic sci-fi visions from the 60s that were trimmed, hacked, or buried because they rattled the nerves of censors and gatekeepers. But here's the twist. In almost every case, the cuts only fueled curiosity, turning these films into cult legends. Which of these chopped-up classics do you think lost the most in the editing room? Drop your thoughts below, hit that like button, and subscribe for more hidden stories from cinema's strangest corners.